Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our fourth and final day of the Middle East Institute's inaugural Futures Forum. I'm Dr. Marwa Maziad, non-resident scholar at the Defense and Security Program at the Middle East Institute, as well as visiting professor of Israel Studies at University of Maryland. In our discussion today, we will address the future of technology in the MENA region and its impact on defense and security. If you have any questions throughout the conversation, please write them in the chat box or email them to events@mei.edu. We are delighted to host two experts on this topic. Cesc Fransman is Senior Middle East Correspondent, Middle East Affairs Analyst for the Jerusalem Post, and author of Drone Wars, Pioneers, Killing Machines, Artificial Intelligence, and a Battle for the Future. He has lived in Israel since 2004, where he has covered the disengagement from Gaza, conflicts in Gaza, the war against ISIS, Iran tensions, and current threats and development. Also joining the New America Foundation. He's a New York Times bestselling author, described in the Wall Street Journal as the premier futurist in the national security environment. His nonfiction books include Wired for War, The Robotics Revolution and Conflict in the 21st Century. He's also the co-author of a new type of novel using the format of a techno-thriller to communicate nonfiction research. It's my pleasure to have this conversation with both of you, so a warm welcome to Seth and Peter. Before we start, I'd like to offer the audience here a working definition of future studies or strategic foresight as an academic discipline that invites us to think about different plausible futures and not only the most probable, likely, or predictable future. We identify weak or emerging signals as well as sources of disruption. And once we identify those, we can formulate various scenarios for the future. In fact, the idea is that there are at least 4 potential futures as we know it. A future scenario of business as usual, where there is continuation of what we have. A second future scenario would be a modified future, a bit of change, but nothing radical really happens. A third future scenario is a collapse one, a future that is no longer any similar to the present, and it might even be characterized by disorder and chaos. A fourth scenario for the future is a transformation one, a future that is quite different than what we have. So, and perhaps better. So taking that to you, Seth and Peter, in your own work, what are some of the salient concepts and issues that you grapple with as you imagine the futures of defense and security? If you can talk a little bit about your work. And also, can you paint for us your vision for the futures of warfare and how much continuity, collapse, or transformation do you envision? So we'll start with Peter.
So I wanted to begin by thanking you for the kind introduction and the Institute for hosting us for this discussion. Background on myself, as you said, what am I working on? My work has essentially followed a thread of wrestling with new trends, new actors, and new technologies that have very much been that definition of how you laid it out in terms of forces of disruption. And often new trends, technology, or actors who did not fit into our original understanding or our older understanding of the way that conflict or political science worked. So for example, my first book was on the rise of private military firms. So companies that were not supplying the goods of warfare, but the service side of warfare, an industry that we saw very active in the Middle East, and everything from the PMCs like Blackwater and the like within Iraq to more recently the operation of Russian private military contractors in conflicts like Libya, and but also other work looking at not just new actors but new domains of conflict. A book looking at cybersecurity. and another more recent book looking at the weaponization of social media. And these are both obvious areas as well as forces of disruption in terms of being both a new domain of conflict, and not just in outright warfare, but in the back and forth that we've seen, for instance, between Israel and Iran. And we've seen new types of weapons introduced, the United States jumping in with something like Stuxnet, but we've also seen the use of cyber weapons by a variety of non-state actor groups, whether it's targeting the Gulf states or the episodes that we've seen recently going after the Iranian subway system, to social media side. Obviously, huge issue when we think about everything from its role that it played in the Arab Spring as a almost kind of spark of protest, but also its role that it played in the rise of a group like ISIS and how it's been deployed as, here again, a weapon, whether it's by non-state actors to state actors. And we've seen Russia targeting the United States election, to we've seen the Gulfy states going back and forth with each other using social media weaponization, targeting each other's regimes, including, circling back to a prior topic, using private contractors to help them conduct those kind of operations. So it's this kind of swirl of new topics that characterizes my work. And I think we've seen very active in this space. And so to bring it all back together to your second question, you asked, what do I see playing out in the future? I'd say real rapidly, three things that matter to the future of not just outright warfare, but conflict and competition globally, but particularly in the Middle East. One, new domains, but connection between those domains. So activity in cyber or even space, but of relevance, say, to determining the outcome of a battle on the land or in the air, or vice versa. Second, the lower barriers to entry of these new technologies. Consistently, they're very different than nuclear weapons or an aircraft carrier. They're comparatively easy to gain and easy to utilize. Connecting to Seth's work, it would take decades to build in the past, a viable air force, but we've seen a variety of non-state actors deploy air power of a kind in a matter of years. Same thing on cyber. And that's only going to continue when you look at new developments in an area like AI. And then finally, new doctrine, new ways of bringing these technologies together that can be incredibly disruptive in how wars are fought. We've seen this in everything from how Turkey's aid to Azerbaijan led to some real game-changing effect in the war that it had with Armenia. The bringing together of unmanned systems, electronic warfare, kinetics, all combined in a new manner, allowed Azerbaijan to take out, the data point was 46% of Armenia's armored vehicles and 93% of its missiles and artillery systems in a matter of weeks. That's a big deal. That's a big change. Or if we look at new doctrines that China is exploring in its use of unmanned systems, where it's, I think we're going to talk about this later, but the idea of swarming. And in Chinese military doctrine, they predict that the future of war is going to be, the translation is, quote, the small but many defeating the big but few. So bringing it all together, that's a lot of change. And I think it's hard to say, given all that change, that we're going to see the continuity scenario. Why would we think that AI and robotics and cyber are somehow going to be less disruptive than, say, what the airplane or the machine gun meant for war? And I think they're obviously going to be more.
Excellent. So Seth, if you can also provide your insights on the same question.
Sure. Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me. In terms of, I think, like my background and what the recent book I've done. So I was, prior to this, covering, conflicts like the war against ISIS and, these kind of what we'd say like, terrorist groups or non-state actors or ungoverned spaces. And I think the interesting thing there is that, that was a period of time when there was a lot of chaos, especially in the Middle East, and many of the world's most powerful countries like the United States were getting involved here, and they were using new technologies like drones and things like that. But the amazing thing about it was they were using all this super new technology against people that were not so sophisticated, right? I mean, even ISIS at its most sophisticated, it used drones and things, but ISIS, was up armoring vehicles in the sense that it was building the type of armored vehicles you would have seen, almost 100 years ago or something. So I think it was this really amazing, strange conflict zone in which you had not only chaos, but you had extreme technology against relatively simple things. And the Israel conflict with Gaza brings that to light as well. I mean, even though Hamas in Gaza has employed now recently Iranian-style drones, just a handful of them, overall what Hamas in Gaza is able to bring to the field compared to what Israel is able to bring to the field, you're just talking about, something that's light years away in terms of the asymmetry. So I think we've seen that decades of conflict. But what strikes me as I began to write the recent book about drone wars, and the reason drones I thought became more and more interesting was as I was covering a lot of defense issues, I realized the degree to which I was transferring from covering terrorists and non-state groups to covering a lot of very complicated technology. And I think that's where we start to see what's the next generation, what's the next step. My sense is that when we look at a lot of the things that are being built today, and I'll give an example from Israel. Israel is rolling out a new type of armored fighting vehicle, which is called the Carmel program. The Carmel program was supposed to kind of transform the concept of a fighting vehicle, create something new, whatever the Bradley or whatever had existed in the past, build something new, which was optionally manned, which means you take the people out, or you have maybe just 2 people in it, or as opposed to 4. And it was supposed to have all this new technology. So for instance, when you sit inside the vehicle, and in a traditional tank, you'd have a gunner, a driver, a commander, what have you. But this vehicle would just basically be a screen with a head-up display or something. And you don't even need to have people in it. And it's got a remote weapon station. Everything is basically remote. There's lots of sensors everywhere. And artificial intelligence is helping guide it through so that it can make its own route and all this stuff. So a human being doesn't have to try to drive through fog or whatever and try to figure this out. And all of that's great, except what is actually happening with that program? It took years to come out. And now the original aspect of Carmel and all the technology being poured into it is going to go into an existing or new fighting vehicle, the Aton, which already exists. So it's taking a lot of cool add-ons and tech and jamming them into an existing platform. It's not recreating the platform. It's not like the first submarine, or the first, it's not a whole new generation. It's just, well, I know what a tank looks like. I already have main battle tanks and armored fighting vehicles and whatever. Let's just take what already exists and put a bunch of stuff on it. It's not like the iPhone did to phones in the sense that I have a phone and now I have something really that's totally new, although we call it a phone, but in fact does everything else. So I think that's where I wonder about, in terms of what does the future really bring? I think that in terms of large parts of the world, we're seeing a transition from the ungoverned spaces and chaos to let's say more authoritarianism, totalitarian regimes, and state control. And that state control relies on things, of course, like surveillance states, like cracking down the internet and all that kind of that type of stuff. In terms of the countries that, let's say, want to remake warfare, and I think he discussed what China is thinking about. Okay, how do we actually confront the Americans? Well, we're not going to build an equal number of F-35s to beat them one at a time. No, we'll just build huge numbers of things, the way the Soviets defeated the Nazis, which is that Soviets build a huge number of machines, even though in each individual tank may not have been better. And so that's an interesting doctrine change. I think we are yet to see, and I don't know when we really will see, the advent of all the stories that we hear about what artificial intelligence can do for us. It's great that you can pack artificial intelligence into, let's say, loitering munitions. And it's interesting that, loitering munitions are different than cruise missiles, but they have many aspects that are similar. The idea of using drone swarms, or the idea of creating kind of an instant air force, the way the Azeris did against the Armenians, and seeing how that plays out, where you don't have to have pilots, you don't have to sacrifice people. I mean, the main change is that you don't sacrifice any people. You don't have to train pilots. But in terms of what the war actually looks like, what actually happened on the ground, and I think he mentioned 40% of the armored vehicles destroyed, 92% of the artillery, or what have you. But that reminds me, to be honest, of, let's say, the German war against the Polish in 1939, when the Polish army was eviscerated in a week or two, right? So in terms of what's actually destroyed on the ground, it's kind of the same thing. So that's why I wonder about, okay, when do we get to the real transformation of war fighting? Or is it this kind of, slow bits of change, and very powerful countries, whether it's China or the United States or certain countries, will roll out all sorts of interesting equipment like AI on rifles and drone swarms. But where will we get to something that really looks like what we call kind of the future of like Star Wars, and like what we think of as swarms of like TIE fighters or something? So I think that's where I wonder about what comes next.
Okay, so this is fascinating and plenty for me to even ask this next question. From what you said, Peter, is that this idea of the barrier to entry is lower now, and there's a change in doctrine, and also there's combination of spaces, like space toward the battlefield, so the combination of domains in a sense. So what does that present to the states vis-a-vis other radical groups that might have access to this technology? What are the implications for the defense community if that is the case and there is equal opportunity access to these technologies?
Thank you. I wanted to circle back to some great things that Seth said, and I love the parallel that he made to the 1939 and what happens when you had the Blitzkrieg come up against a dated Polish army. And there's interesting things, though. There's two parts of that. The first thing is that German army was actually still mostly horse-drawn. 90%, it wasn't actually fully mechanized yet. It had just sort of figured out the new doctrine. But there's an even more interesting parallel to what he was saying about the example of the Israeli systems, where we're sort of taking the new technology and layering it back on top of the old, which is there's the same phenomena going on in US military programs and allied programs and the like, is that when I do speeches for military officers on these issues, I'll actually pull out these old photos from the 1930s, which I think is very much a comparable period. And it'll show, for example, the battleships, the battleship captains thought that they were embracing the future by putting the float plane on the top of the battleship to scout ahead of the battleship, because it was going to make the battleship better. And it was, but they were missing this larger phenomena of aircraft carriers. Or there's another great photo that I'll show of a experimental military training exercise from the 1930s. And it shows a horse-drawn wagon with a machine gun mounted on the back of it. So it's the idea of like, we're embracing change. We got the machine gun, but I'm not changing this other part. And I think there's a lot of that going on in this circles connects what his point to your question. I think there's a lot of that going on within state militaries today, where they think they're embracing change, but they're changing just enough not to change. And they're kind of layering on top of it. And that's where you see, the threat to state actors is what happens when a adversary comes in with a capability that they didn't plan for, or that maybe they planned for, but not of the scope or the scale that they imagined. So one of the things that as junky, as not so great, the drones that non-state actors, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, what they've done is change the dynamic where when you were intervening into another conflict, if you were the state power, whether it was the United States going into Vietnam or the Saudis going into Yemen, it was difficult for that non-state actor to reach out and touch you. And you didn't have to think about your own defenses whether it was of your bases from air attack to your airports, your pipelines. And that lower barrier to entry, whether it's with very, cursory drones, that's the other aspect of cyber warfare, is that it's giving those non-state actors the ability to reach back and touch valued assets of the state that's intervening. And one of the things that we really need to focus on here is, the cost dynamic of it. Yes, I use a recent example of in Israel, and Seth would follow this closer. I understand there was a recent, what they called it a swarm attack, and it was, if I remember the number, it was 5. And then Israel used a combination of, Iron Dome, and I think actually an F-16 also intervened. That was a success for Israel in defending against it. It was an economic and strategic failure when you did the cost benefit analysis of what it took to pay for the defense against that. And it's only just the start. So, 5 is not a swarm. A swarm is, the world record holder number of swarm is 3,500. And that you're not going to be able to do Iron Dome style cost investment F-16s against. And that number that I gave you, that was not done by a government. That was actually done by the Genesis company. So the ability to throw up large numbers of drones is something that has already been proven in the private sector, and we'll see this move on into the non-state threat and state side. And so again, you have to think about not just the threat, but kind of the cost benefit to defend against it and what that gives the adversary.
So Seth, maybe building on this as well. So then what do you think some of these nascent conflicts that might explode as a direct result of this use of technology? So do you think even some conflicts might be upended or reduced in their impact because of these technologies? That the medium itself of using drones versus huge airplanes might change the nature of conflicts?
Well, I would generally say that, drones are interesting, and I wrote a book about them. But in the end of the day, and it's, drone swarms. If any country ever put together 3,000 drones, to try to win a conflict, let's say between, China and Taiwan or something, that would be totally wild to see. But in terms of what we're actually seeing, like Hamas using just several drones, or the Houthis have used them over the years against Saudi Arabia, in general, you're seeing, kind of pinprick attacks. These kind of drones don't win wars. And in general, also, and neither do missiles. The ballistic missiles that have been trafficked by Iran to Hezbollah or sent to Iraq or Syria or wherever, Scud missiles and missiles don't win wars. We have yet to see that happen. So I think that in the hands of terrorist groups or terrorist armies or non-state actors, they can harass cities and harass people. And a nightmare scenario is that they could be used against strategic infrastructure. Like you could use a bunch of drones to target an oil pipeline or, an electricity grid or an airport. In case of Israel, that's a problem because Israel really only has one large civilian airport. So that's why Israel pours massive amounts of resources into multi-layered, air defense that is among the best in the world. But I think one of the things I tend to believe is that the non-state actors, I think, are a bit on the back foot now. I think they had an interesting heyday, let's say from the 80s to the time of ISIS, and they may have reached a peak because I think in the end of the day, they don't, without state backing, they generally don't have access to a lot of this technology. Now, and that's why we have to ask ourselves when we look at Hezbollah or the Houthis or the Hajj al-Shabi in Iraq, or even Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, some of these groups are in fact more like proxy groups. They're not in fact always non-state actors. Actually, the non-state actors we see in places like, let's say, parts of Africa, where you have, rebel groups and things that are truly maybe non-state or whatever, and it's just total chaos. They don't actually usually have drones and things. They have AK-47s or they have suicide bombers or whatever. When we start to see them have drones, real drones, bigger ones, or missiles, like the Hezbollah has an arsenal of more than 100,000 missiles, that tends to be because it's kind of actually a proxy group. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how's that different than the private military contractors or something, or that he's been discussing? So I think I kind of tend to believe the era of non-state actors may be, narrowing down or closing down, because even the Taliban, for instance, that's come back to power in Afghanistan in a kind of amazing, weird, strange way. From what I can understand, it was midwife back to power, not only quietly through some countries that supported it, but also the fact that it was being hosted in Qatar, and the US kind of signed a deal with it. So it wasn't that this insurgent group suddenly won. It was that a combination of factors enabled it to kind of come back. And that's kind of where I see these non-state actors or whatever, like, where are they winning? ISIS was an extraordinary, strange phenomenon in which it was truly a non-state actor. No one was really helping it. And it gathered together, 50, 100,000 fighters from all over the world. It did take over a swath of territory that was as large as a country or so, and then kind of ran that for several years. So, but then it was defeated. So I tend to think maybe we're seeing those actors being shuffled off stage left. And as I said before, I think regional states and authoritarian regimes are coming back in where there was access to power, and where we don't see that happening maybe is parts of Africa, or some of these unresolved areas in the Middle East, like what's happening in Yemen, in places like that. But again, I would argue the Houthis, the only reason that they're as successful as they have been is partly around support.
So then actually there is a question right there asking whether we're exaggerating then the threat of non-state actors, so that we start fighting state-to-state fights by exaggerating some of these non-state actors. Is that, do you see it this way or not?
Me? Exaggerating them, I don't know if we're exaggerating them. I think these groups can be very, very dangerous, and I think the degree to which Hezbollah or groups like that play often a multifaceted role, where they're in parliament, but they're also an armed militia, but they also do assassinations, but they also import oil and have banks, and it's like, well, what is it? But I don't know about exaggeration. I tend to think the West is kind of bored of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency and wants to get out of that business. As we hear everyone say, America wants to pivot to big, near peer competition, Asia, and they're done with dealing with the Middle East, which what that effectively means is outsourcing things in the Middle East to someone else. So that means Iran, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, whoever, China, Russia. That's my sense of it.
Okay.
I'm struck by. I'm sorry. I'm struck by. One of the things we have here is divergence on the theory of victory. What does it mean to win? And I'm gonna make a parallel to something. So have patience with me. There is the new movie Dune is out, that is based off of the great science fiction novel, and there was a game that came out of that novel that it was like a strategy game, and you could play the different actors in the game, and they had the different equivalent of the state powers that would compete over the valuable desert territories filled with valuable resources and the like. But there was one non-state actor in the game that's also in the movie, the Freeman, who their victory does not come, if you played them, by seizing territory, making the other actors lose their assets, leave the game. They win only by staying in the game. And I think that is that we need to recognize more so the theory of victory, and not just theory, but arguably proven theory of victory for the variety of non-state actors that are out there, whether it was Taliban, whether it's Houthis in Yemen, whether we're looking in Lebanon. For non-state actors and in insurgencies and civil wars, particularly when they're going against powerful states or regimes or the like, it's not, the victory doesn't necessarily come in the same way. It comes by staying in the game. So if you think about what Saudi, its theory of victory in Yemen, as opposed to, I would say the insurgent group there actually achieved its goals. It stayed in the game, and it forced a much more powerful set of state actors to negotiate with it when they went in thinking, in large part because of this higher technology, that they would be able to triumph. And instead, and Seth's exactly right, supported by other state actors, by Iran, but basically able to stay in the game, drag it out. It's not that, it's not that the Saudis got bored in Yemen, or the UAE got bored in Yemen, or the United States got bored in Afghanistan. It's that it dragged on so long and exacted such costs that we decided it was not of the same value that we thought going in. The cost benefit analysis in both of the regime, but the public basically said enough is enough. So for non-state actors, their goal primarily when it comes to competing with a state, competing with a regime, is to stay in the game. That is their often theory of victory. I think you can see that parallel with Hamas and Hezbollah as well, competing against Israel. For them, it's not seizing Tel Aviv. It's the fact that they've stayed active. They've stayed in the game. And again, these new technologies give them another means to do so, another means to reach out and exact costs that often play out differently for them. So yeah, that's where I would go after it. Now, the direct answer to the question, is this often an excuse for state powers to intervene? Look, I mean, I've got a different attitude on it. The United States didn't invade Iraq because of non-state actor. We invaded Iraq because of a clearly wrong and absurd, and I argued against it, false claim at the time of false claims at WMD. Different if Afghanistan, we go into Afghanistan in 2001 because of a very real and proven threat from a non-state actor, 9/11, that had just killed over 3,000. So I differ from that question in both ways. In the case examples that people use, it's not exaggerated non-state actor threat, because the one time that we did go in because of non-state actor, I would say it was valid. The other case that they were citing, that wasn't non-state actor threat claim, that was state actor, was Saddam claimed.
I would agree with you on both Afghanistan and Iraq, this characterization. But then does this mean that we ultimately lost in Afghanistan now that the very Taliban that we went to fight is the one in power 20 years later? So they outlasted us, and is that a complete defeat in these terms?
I think you're seeing basically in America coming to grips with, on one hand, you have cross-partisan, both large majorities of Democrat and Republican, and a Republican president who negotiated an end to a war, and in turn a Democrat president who inherited and had the withdrawal. By that measure, they achieved their policy goals, reflected what the American public wanted. On the other hand, you have a military and a discourse right now that's saying we lost, and why and how did we lose. And part of it is, and it's multi-causal, right? It's everything from, as Seth rightly said, you allow a nugget of a non-state actor group to escape into Pakistan. It has a sanctuary. It's supported by Pakistani state. I mean, one of the most interesting moments after the fall of Kabul is that finally the ISI leadership, after years and years of denial, shows up in Kabul with a big old Cheshire cat smile on their face, saying, kind of looking like they've achieved their goals. But look, it's also, you had a U.S. effort that was too primarily military focused, never really dealt with political reform, fundamental, huge corruption issues that, frankly, we probably exacerbated in Afghanistan. You had, this regime, is it collapsing because the Taliban was so militarily effective, or also the fact that you had police forces that hadn't been paid in 6 months? You have this kind of multi-causal thing coming together. But yeah, basically the Taliban stayed on the board, stayed active for 20 plus years. and an American public and political scene that got, frankly, weary of it and wasn't willing to stay for another 20 years.
Okay, so moving to another question, and maybe it connects a little bit to content of conflicts. Are we going to have more ideological clashes, competition over certain ideas or resources, the old-fashioned way of conflicts, or the format of conducting warfare is going to change that core of conflicts? Seth.
Well, I think that in terms of ideological conflict, I would tend to think that the 20th century was a century of ideas and genocidal, some of which were genocidal ideas, I think. And there was a lot of ideological conflict. I think that this century appears to be very different. And I think we can look at the countries that appear to be rising powers don't really seem to be projecting a lot of ideas exactly. So I would think that, no, we're not going to see conflicts over ideas. In terms of conflicts over resources, it would appear that there will be some conflicts over resources, but the general drive, I think, towards in the West, say, towards dealing with climate change and renewables and things, it may mean that they doesn't need to be that kind of conflict either. So I think that definitely the types of conflicts that we appear to think that we'll see will be the ones that people predict will happen in Asia, maybe between the West and China at some point. And I don't know about the rest of the world. I would tend to think that the Middle East may be closing a chapter on decades of vicious conflict. I mean, it's not a chapter that will close like this, but I do sense that there is an overall slowing down and reduction in certain areas.
So to you, Seth, and I would just say that China is, after all, an idea. Its system is an idea. The Western system are ideas. So I don't know, or Russia is an idea. In a way, maybe some of the regional players are interested in attaching or pairing up with China or Russia, that is gravitating towards a certain idea, even authoritarian form, or the emphasis on a state vis-a-vis those militias and non-state actors is an idea as well. So I don't know how much we can get away from ideas. Do you agree, Peter, or no?
Well, if you frame it that way, yeah, I mean, everything connects to an idea. I think there's two aspects that I would pull out that might be threads to pull further in this discussion. One is we've always seen in the grand scheme of history, a interaction between ideologies and the prevailing economy and technology of the day. So you can't tell the story of the rise of nationalism and the concept of the nation state, whether it's playing out in Europe or in the Arab world. The nation state comes out of concepts from the printing press and the spread of literacy and the like, and how that both is mobilized by political leaders and regimes to create a sense of identity, often in certain situations that didn't exist beforehand, shared around language or the like. Big examples of that you can see in the Balkans, et cetera. And so same thing if we think about the ideologies of communism and fascism. They come out of the Industrial Revolution. You can't imagine the way they play out without the Industrial Revolution, right? And we spend roughly 100 years kind of working through the implications of that. And in turn, the modern version of liberal democracy and that type of state is a reaction to that. So it's wrapped up within the Industrial Revolution. So given that, can we expect, do we have equivalent kind of new technologies, new changes going on? I think you can and make a reasonable argument that we're seeing a kind of a new version of an industrial revolution when we think about the shifts in robotics, whether it's in manufacturing, transportation, the application of AI into everything from not just warfare, but medicine, finance, policing, real estate, whatever. I'm not the only one who would say, yeah, we're seeing sort of equivalents of a new kind of industrial revolution playing out much like the last over decades. And I don't think it's unreasonable to think that we'll see different kinds of ideologies or reactions or disruptions that come out of that. In even a good example would be Oxford did a study and found that roughly 47% of occupational specialties, types of jobs, are going to be disrupted, drastically reduced, or completely replaced over the next generation. That hits nations, that hits economies. People react, and then maybe they're more prone to extremism, or we see new ideologies come out, whatever. So that's one thing that I would say. I think we could project that kind of disruption. The other, though, is whatever the ideology or idea that's being that's emerging, or the old one that's being pushed. Here again, this is where I look at the weaponization of social media. You can inject it, you can push it much more rapidly, much more widespread by driving it viral right now. So whatever that change is, it's going to play out much quicker than before. You think about the example of the Arab Spring and how it's, you see it spread rapidly from, a single act in Tunisia, and then we're moving on and seeing ripple effects everywhere from Cairo to it's part of the protests that lead to the Syrian civil war. Very rapid change. And the other part of social media weaponization, of course, is that it doesn't always have to be true what goes viral, and it can be used as a deliberate spark for protest to try and drive and create a protest. We've seen examples of that in the United States. We had protests where the Russians induced both sides of the protest to show up in Florida. The protesters and the counter protesters didn't know they were both being sort of steered there by Russian actors. You can have accidental information that no one's deliberately injecting that still causes people to show up even armed. There was an example of that in South Sudan. Or you can use it as a way to create sort of the claimed cause for a crisis. Look at what played out between the states inside the GCC, and you had false narratives injected of what, if I remember it correctly, it was like, what did the emir post or not inside his email or not, and it was hacked or not. But the point was, you had this sort of social media weaponization being deployed back and forth, even inside the GCC, let alone between those states and Iran. How ideas spread and whether they're truthful or not is also being altered.
So if we can talk a little bit about the technology again. So in your novel, Seth, you there's a quote there that there is a Marine that's saying he'd be damned if he's going to be the first Marine pilot to get shot down by a drone. So there is this sense of those robotic quadcopters that are maneuvering F-35. How do you see the institutions, the military institutions themselves, adopting to these technologies? You touch upon that, but if you can tell us a little bit how flexible or unflexible they are.
I think the question was for me, unless Seth has also done some novels too. So what we've been utilizing is a concept that we call useful fiction. And useful fiction is the idea of doing nonfiction research and analysis, but sharing it not through the traditional white paper, which, let's be blunt, most people, not just public, but all the way to government ministers and generals, don't actually read. I know that's really painful for all of us in think tanks and academia to admit, but that's the reality that we all know in our heart of hearts. And so we share the research through scenario, through vignettes. It's different than from science fiction in that you are not dreaming it up. You've got to do your academic research. You've got to draw from that real world. So that example you gave, that I believe that was in Ghost Fleet, it was sharing research on what the military is actually working on when it comes to visions of future air warfare, not just the integration of drones that you're operating remotely, like whether Israel's done over Gaza or the United States over Afghanistan and Pakistan, but that you're moving to, it's called human machine teaming, and that you will have both the manned and the unmanned platform working together. But what does that look like? And what are the challenges of it? Not just tactically, but emotionally, cognitively. Let's get in the seat of that Marine who's flying alongside that unmanned system that's been tasked as the research, as and it's not dreaming it up. I mean, the United States has run robotic wingman programs. Australia just did it. To give a good example, it's not just going to be big states or the Chinas. Israel's had that. It's not just going to be in the air. We see similar kind of teaming on the ground. And so the issue is not just what can the robot do? It's how does the human react to the robot? What are areas where they're going to be able to work together well? Where are areas that they're not going to be able to work together well? But also, in a scenario, let's play it out further. What about the adversary? The idea, in warfare, it's the concept that the enemy gets a vote. In fiction, it's the idea that it would be a terrible story if the story was the good guys did X, everything went according to plan, the end. So let's explore how the adversary is going to react to it, try and find vulnerabilities, go after it, whether it's going after the cyber side, or maybe they engage in lawfare, which is the concept of I knowingly take advantage of certain things. So for, we've seen this in wars. I know that you're observing me from above in a way that you couldn't previously with unmanned systems and spy satellites. I know that you can hit with precision strike. So guess what? I'm going to move my weapons around in a ambulance. And so I've flipped it and given you a thorny problem. Or I'm going to deploy a robotic system, machine gun armed. It is not sci-fi. We've seen everyone from Israel to China to Russia. Is the best counter to that another machine gun armed robot? Is it electronic warfare, cyber warfare to go after new vulnerabilities? Or maybe it's a 6-year-old with a can of spray paint.
Wow. So maybe now to Seth, you had some visceral experience being in Iraq while seeing some of these drones around you. How you've described some of that in your book. Can you share a little bit of that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I told in the beginning of the book was when we were going into Mosul, I think back now, it must have been 2017 during the final battle for what was left of ISIS in the old city of Mosul, and ISIS had been using drones against the Iraqi army, and the Iraqi army had a lot of superiority in terms of man and machines and the backing by this massive coalition. I think the coalition was like 70 countries or something. I mean, so you thought, well, how can ISIS, what can they put in the field that will scare the Iraqi army? But in fact, they were really frightened by the ISIS drones, and the ISIS drones were not that sophisticated. They were apparently like quadcopters with a grenade on them or a mortar shell or something. But it was spooky because every time we were going in on vehicles and then on foot, and every time they'd hear this buzzing, they didn't know, is it our drone or is it one of the ISIS drones or is it something else I'm hearing? They had no idea, and they had no way to detect it. They had no radars, really. They didn't have a way to call in and ask someone. They didn't have a way even to get the coalition on the phone and say, yeah, okay, we've got a drone here. Can you guys bring in something to kill it? So it was extraordinary the degree to which all this resources, apparently the most wealthy countries in the world, trying to defeat this, what was left of this terrorist organization, which had a few thousand fighters at the time, was totally bedeviled by this thing and totally scared. And I remember, they were scared of snipers, but the drones really freaked them out. And as someone who's been on the border also with Lebanon and Israel, if you go to the northern border there, it seems to me in some places there is like 24 hours drones buzzing around. I mean, in this case, Israeli drones, not usually Hezbollah drones. But I mean, it's unnerving, the idea that you've got these machines over you somewhere. It's not like having a global hawk, 10, 20,000 feet up where you don't know. Fine, it's way up there, but no one can see it. It's not, that doesn't matter. I think it's the idea that there's all these machines around and you don't know how to deal with them. And I think that spooks people out. And I think that even if it's a friendly force, because I've been in these new multi-dimensional exercises and stuff in Israel, where ostensibly all the technology is being put to use and the frontline soldier is feeding back information via network and everything's supposed to work perfectly. But even so, if you're the frontline soldier, I mean, you hear the buzzing, okay, maybe it's one of ours, but what do you know about it? You can't communicate with it. You don't have it on a screen. You don't know what's going on. And I think putting all that technology into play is something that I've seen firsthand. It's something you wonder about. I mean, I went to a demonstration where they had a robotic dog and a drone go into a house together as a team. There was no man in this team. And ostensibly the dog and the drone were supposed to map the house, find the weapons because they have some sort of target recognition. And then meanwhile, the special forces team is able to build a 3D model or map it out and see it live as it's happening. And then that, of course, can prepare them to go in and kill the adversary. In this case, it was a few dummies that were set up to see if the drones would find them. But it was, the idea is, okay, if the enemy in there kills your drone or shoots or kicks over the dog, fine, I didn't lose any people. But nevertheless, the idea that, yeah, soon the soldiers will go in, within a squad, 2 guys and a robotic dog and a drone. It's unclear how that will get there. I think the idea that in a squad of soldiers or special forces or police, that you will have a drone operator the way you would have a sniper or a medic or any other or radio operator, i.e. a skill set for one of the people. And that person, will carry in their pack loitering munitions, and they'll have a tablet and they can use drones, and they can have even something like a robotic dog that they can throw that will walk along and do stuff. I see that. I think the question is, when you get to larger machines and stuff, how much a soldier wants to walk alongside, let's say a lot like an RV or a larger machine that doesn't have people in it, and just trust that someone's going to drive it correctly and not run into them. I assume it will take time, because the machines can be quite smart, because the machine ostensibly has sensors everywhere. So it shouldn't drive over people. But I think the feeling that you get is like the thing might have a remote weapon station or machine gun on it. I mean, how much do I trust that? And I think, there's going to have to be a lot of work put into that.
Okay, so maybe one final question to both of you, whether the Middle East will continue to be important and relevant in this whole notion of strategic competition or great power competition, and whether, to what extent China and Russia and outside players, including the United States and Europe, would collaborate with MENA nations to influence regional conflict and conflict management through this use of technology. So do you foresee that China will have relations with some of the nations regarding its 5G, AI, what type of competition might manifest in the region along these players?
Well, I see the Middle East today, as going through a major change between, let's say, the decades when you had not only Arab nationalism and the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and then, of course, the Arab Spring and the question of whether there be democratization, et cetera, and then you had the rise of all these vicious terrorist groups at the same time, kind of with a whole generation of people involved in Al-Qaeda, then involved in Daesh or ISIS. I tend to think, as I said before, that the larger regional powers, many of which in this case are non-Arab, so it's a big change from the era of Arab nationalism. It's the Iran and Turkey and Israel. Seem to be the ones that are, let's say, more wealthy or more powerful in the region. And the Arab countries generally seem to have taken a step back, which is to say, even Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, or Egypt, or Iraq, or Syria, wherever you'd like to put your finger, countries that played a huge role. I think even countries like Saudi Arabia have had to consolidate overall their role in the region a bit, and they're taking a bit of a step back. There will be, of course, a reactionary effect or a reactionary change, I think, in the future. But that's what I see in the Middle East. And that would mean generally, I think, that the Middle East, even though the US wants to say, well, it's less important and we don't want to deal with it. Of course, the Middle East is like I think in that scene in Godfather 3 where he says, well, they drag me back in. The Middle East is always going to bring countries together because it is a center of all sorts of things that are happening. And the fact that China's got this new deal with Iran, the fact that you've got Turkey, Russia, you've got so many factors moving around. Draw me a map of Africa or South America where all that's happening. It's, yeah, China's involved in those places, but you're not talking about, the top big economies involved. And you're not talking about the kind of deals that happen between India and the UAE and between France and Greece and the Mediterranean, the way this region is like a hinge or a pivot for a series of different things taking place. So the Middle East will continue to be important. I think maybe it won't be important as much in terms of spreading religious extremism and chaos. I tend to think the extremism and religious extremism we saw in the 80s, 90s, and 1000s is going to move to the periphery. And that's where you'll see, we'll see more extremism and issues in the periphery, whether it's Europe or wherever. I mean, the periphery of the Middle East. And the Middle East will become a great power competition a bit, and regional states and of course, rising authoritarianism, that will happen. And that's my sense of where we'll see things going. And we'll see the Belt and Road Initiative and the India, France, Greece, Israel, UAE connection growing and things like that.
Okay. So, well, Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Not much. I do not present myself as a Middle East politics expert, so I won't weigh in. I think Seth summed it up really well. You clearly have a continued importance of the Middle East when it comes to whether it's trade routes to energy. I mean, we're not going to see a full transition away from the kind of energy economy that we have right now for certainly several decades. That stays. You have the trend because of that of China's greater reliance on that, which has led to it, I think, flexing its muscles, bringing in greater presence than in the past. I think that continues. It also obviously has a strategic push to try and wrap in a larger network of infrastructure. And we see that. And maybe one thing that I would add is that you see that greater China presence of, selling national level infrastructure, whether it's, classic ports to more pertinently on the technology side, 5G networks and the like. And I would say, I basically maybe end with this is that there's the idea of don't look a gift horse in the mouth, but actually you should. Because if we look at the vulnerabilities that that technology brings in both a greater dependence on Chinese state companies as opposed to just the general global market. Once you are relying on that infrastructure, you are sucked into that network. And second, it's not just that dependence in a way that's very different than it would have been to, you don't have that on the infrastructure side to like US government as an example. But it's also a second kind of vulnerability, which is the cybersecurity vulnerability. And so a great example to look at would be what happened at the African Union headquarters, where it was gifted and man, that thing was just shooting out information on all its users. I mean, it was like the cyber version of Swiss cheese. So I would say for the nations that are thinking about these wonderful seeming offers of tech and infrastructure deals from Chinese state-linked companies, do look that gift horse in the mouth.
Well, with that, I'll thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, Peter Singer and Seth Frantzman. I personally learned a lot from you, and I hope the audience learned as much. And we will leave you with the next session, actually, that will be Next Horizons in Cybersecurity and Digital Threats in MENA. So that's going to tie into what you just said, Peter. Thank you so much and take care.